In this lecture, we're going to provide an introduction to research designs, the reasons why research designs are important, and begin the process of examining different types of research based upon the intention of that research and the resulting design of those types of projects. And when we think about the design of a research study, this refers to an individual research study. It's essentially a plan, a roadmap, an organization process on how to conduct a research study. And this process is conceptualized before the actual research takes place. So before any sort of information is obtained in a laboratory or clinical setting, the researchers lay out this plan or this roadmap on the different steps and the different elements to take into consideration when conducting that research. Now, the two main factors that will influence the plan here, the design, is the actual research question. So a clearly defined, very objectively stated research question, that understanding by the researchers will essentially lead those researchers to developing that roadmap. And the goals, the outcome of the actual study, the intention is the second important factor that will guide how to put that research project together. And so those are the two major factors that are ideal in determining the design, but in actual reality there are practical considerations that will impact the ability to carry out that project and will influence the research design. The first here is what we refer to as the accessible population. And so research examining humans begins with the identification of a population of interest. And from that population of interest, the researchers will draw a sample. Now, in this example here, the accessible population, if based upon the research question and the goals of the research, relate to hospitalized patients that are being treated for cancer. Now, in an ideal situation, the design is going to be driven by the research question and the goals. But in a practical sense, how accessible is this population for the researchers here? And so there are some very practical limitations that would impact the ability to design a study based ideally on a question and the goals. The second major practical consideration are the resources available. So the researchers could develop a very important research question, clearly lay out the goals and set up the design, but the researchers may likely be limited by funding mechanisms that would allow them to carry out the study, access to laboratory or clinical facilities, and administrative support. So these are all the realistic practical implications that will impact the research design after the researchers have generated the research question and laid out the goals of that research. The rest of this unit, we're going to examine research design based on the goal of establishing one of two different outcomes, and that's causation or correlation. When we talk about causation, specifically, it is research that is attempting to establish cause and effect. So where the outcome can clearly be linked to some type of effect or some type of factor that was built into the research design. Correlation types of research, which is what we'll focus on in this unit as well, will not establish cause and effect, but will establish important relationships between certain variables. There is one classification. We'll look at a number of different classifications, but when we start thinking about different research designs, we begin with this very broad definition of different types of research, to which there are three of them. The first is referred to as basic research, and basic research has also been referred to as fundamental research. Other terms that have been Another term that has been used is pure research. These two terms here in the first bullet item you should be aware of, but the term basic is the more predominant use of when referring to these types of studies. And these types of studies are limited in terms of the practical applications. And so this type of research is designed not around, this is important, not around the practical application of the findings, but rather this research is designed to investigate and establish underlying biomechanical, anatomical, or physiological mechanisms that are responsible for functioning of the human organism. And in this example, here we see this research paper published in 2016, and this particular research paper aimed to examine the relationship between acetylcholine, and acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter released by endothelial cells, and the goal was to examine the relationship between this neurotransmitter and this outcome measurement, which is flow-mediated dilatation. Now, in this particular study, the goal here was to examine a physiological relationship between these factors, and this particular study will have implications down the line, implications for further research, possibly for clinical application, but this type of research is not designed for clinical application. It's designed for investigating those underlying mechanisms that may have future implications, not necessarily applications. That sits in contrast to applied research, and applied research are research studies that are so designed in order to have that direct practical application or direct clinical applications. Now, this type of research is based on a general premise or assumption, and the general premise and assumption is often based upon the outcomes of the basic research studies. But those sorts of assumptions are not directly evaluated, not directly tested in these types of studies. And so the researchers will base the foundation of the study on the outcomes of many of the underlying mechanisms established in the basic research, but will not evaluate those as part of the methodology. And here we see an example in this study published in 2015 where the researchers sought to examine the relationship. Actually, this study was more than the relationship. This study sought to examine cause and effect with a exercise technique called deadlift exercise, resistance exercise training. And the title of the article here implies that a cause and effect was established. And we see that this intervention of deadlift training, based upon the title, increased the rate of torque development and vertical jump performance in novices. And so these are outcome measurements and variables often assessed in formal athletic events, formalized athletic training, and we can see here in this study they sought to examine something that is used by many, an exercise technique used by many, and how it might affect some outcome measurement that is used in the field of athletic performance and training. So this is a direct applied research, but what this research does not establish are the physiological mechanisms responsible for the cause and effect. The researchers based those physiological mechanisms on the previously established basic research studies. The third type of research is an emerging area that is getting much more focus, and that's called translational research. Oftentimes, the bench to bedside reference is used when describing translational research, and the bench to bedside approach here implies that the bench refers to the laboratory bench where that basic research is carried out, and this is research aimed to try to bridge the gap from that laboratory basic type of research to the actual patient, the bedside. And so this type of research applies those basic scientific findings and tries to make that direct connection to those clinically relevant questions and generating the scientific questions on clinical issues. One such example is the Human Genome Project. And the Human Genome Project was established a few decades ago, and since that, the National Institutes of Health in Washington, D.C., the largest government granting agency in the world, established a branch or an institute called the National Human Genome Research Institute. And so the Human Genome Project was carried out in the laboratory with the goal of translating that mapping of the human genetic code to treatment of various diseases by understanding that basic science and using that to develop, for example, gene therapies to have a positive outcome or to try to generate positive outcomes for various diseases and conditions. So this ends our first lecture on research study designs.